Tonight, we're covering one of the most explosive and transformative events in world history, the French Revolution. What began with calls for bread and justice in 1789 would soon topple a monarchy, ignite terror in the streets of Paris, and reshape the very meaning of freedom across the globe. From royal palaces to guillotines, from philosophical ideals to political bloodshed, this is the story of a revolution that changed everything. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you're watching. Now, let's begin our journey through revolution, reform, and the fall of kings, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. In the final decades of the 18th century, the Kingdom of France stood as one of the most powerful and culturally influential nations in Europe. Its palaces were grand, its court rituals refined, and its nobility steeped in centuries of tradition. Yet beneath the gilded ceilings of Versailles and the polished boots of royal soldiers, the very foundations of this ancient order were crumbling. France, for all its beauty and ceremony, was a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. At the heart of this unraveling stood King Louis XVI, a well-meaning but indecisive monarch who had inherited more than a crown. He had inherited a nation drowning in debt. The wars of the previous century, particularly the costly 7 Years' War, and France's support for the American colonies during their revolution, had left the royal treasury dangerously empty. Taxes were uneven and unfair, falling heaviest on the poor and sparing the nobility and clergy. The sprawling government was inefficient and riddled with corruption. Grain shortages, poor harvests, and rising bread prices added desperation to the daily lives of ordinary people. The French people were divided into what were known as the three estates. The first estate comprised the clergy, the bishops, priests, and abbots who were responsible for the spiritual life of the nation and who often lived in luxury. The second estate was the nobility, landowners and aristocrats who paid little to no taxes, enjoyed special privileges, and often filled the highest ranks of government and military positions. The third estate, which made up over 95% of the population, included everyone else: peasants, farmers, urban workers, merchants, and professionals, men and women who worked, suffered, and bore the financial burdens of the kingdom. This inequality, so deeply embedded in French society, had existed for centuries. But by the 1780s, it was becoming intolerable. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu had spent decades questioning the divine right of kings, the privileges of the aristocracy, and the rigid structures of feudalism. Their ideas spread across salons, pamphlets, and newspapers, igniting debate and sowing seeds of rebellion. People began to ask questions that could not be easily silenced. Why should a noble be exempt from taxes while a starving baker's apprentice pays with his last coin? Why should laws protect the rich and punish the poor? Why must one be born to power when merit could serve the nation better? It was in this volatile atmosphere, in the spring of 1789, that King Louis XVI called for a meeting of the Estates General, a national assembly of representatives from all three estates. It had not been summoned in over 175 years. Desperate for solutions and hoping to gain support for new taxes, Louis believed the Estates General might offer a path out of financial ruin. But instead of salvation, the assembly would unleash forces he could neither understand nor control. Delegates from the Third Estate, who arrived with grievances and hopes of reform, quickly realized that their voices would once again be drowned out by the combined voting power of the First and Second Estates. Frustration turned to defiance. On June 17, 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming they represented the true will of the French people. When they were locked out of their meeting hall days later, they gathered in an indoor tennis court and made a historic vow, the Tennis Court Oath, promising not to disband until they had written a new constitution for France. It was the first open break with the old order. The revolution had begun. The summer of 1789 unfolded with a sense of electric uncertainty. In Paris and across the French countryside, the population watched anxiously as the National Assembly stood defiant, refusing to yield to the king's authority. Within the halls of Versailles, Louis XVI and his advisors debated, hesitated, and ultimately misjudged the seriousness of the moment. While the monarchy maneuvered to preserve its power, the people were already awakening to the idea that sovereignty might no longer belong to a crown, but to themselves. The National Assembly's bold declaration had inspired hope among the Third Estate, but also fear among the privileged classes. Rumors began to swirl that the king would send in the army to dissolve the assembly by force. In Paris, where prices were rising and food was scarce, such rumors ignited a growing fury. Crowds gathered daily in squares and marketplaces, their discussions fueled by pamphlets, speeches, and the words of men like Camille Desmoulins, who shouted from café tables that tyranny was at the gates. On July 11th, the king dismissed his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker, who had been sympathetic to the Third Estate and the reforms they sought. This single decision sent a clear message to the people. The king had chosen resistance over reconciliation. The city of Paris exploded into unrest. Mobs began looting for weapons. Barricades appeared in the streets. The mood turned from anxious to revolutionary. Then, on July 14, 1789, the people of Paris turned their attention to a symbol, a fortress prison that represented the absolute power of the monarchy, the Bastille. Though it held only a few prisoners at the time, the Bastille was a feared and hated symbol of royal authority, a place where individuals could be locked away without trial by the king's command. More importantly for the insurgents, it was believed to house gunpowder. Armed with muskets seized from the Hôtel des Invalides earlier that day, a large crowd of citizens, artisans, and soldiers approached the Bastille. Negotiations began, but tensions rose quickly. Shots were fired. Chaos erupted. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd, now swelled with angry Parisians and defecting soldiers from the French Guard, stormed the outer courtyard. The defenders, a small group of royal troops and Swiss mercenaries, could not hold. Eventually, the governor of the Bastille, Bernard de Launay, surrendered, but he did not survive. He was seized, beaten, and killed by the mob. His head was paraded through the streets on a pike. The fall of the Bastille sent a shockwave through France. Though the actual military value of the victory was minimal, its symbolism was immense. The people had risen up, attacked a monument of royal power, and triumphed. It marked a point of no return. Across the country, peasants and commoners were emboldened. The revolution was no longer confined to political debate, it had spilled into the streets and become a movement of action. In Versailles, Louis XVI asked, upon hearing the news, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," came the famous reply. "It is a revolution." To prevent further bloodshed, the king was forced to acknowledge the National Assembly. He ordered the troops around Paris withdrawn and appeared to accept, at least outwardly, the rising tide of change. But the people had already discovered their power. They had broken a symbol. They had armed themselves. They had tasted resistance and victory. And across France, a fire had been lit that would soon consume every pillar of the old regime. The storming of the Bastille had cracked the shell of royal authority in Paris, but the tremors it unleashed rippled far beyond the city walls. In the countryside, where peasants had long lived under the weight of feudal dues, tithes, and noble privileges, fear and anger began to boil over. Rumors spread like wildfire, stories of foreign armies marching to crush the revolution, of nobles hiding grain to starve the poor, of bandits in service to the aristocracy burning villages. These stories, though often untrue, were believed with conviction. And fear, once ignited, quickly turned to fury. What followed was a wave of spontaneous uprisings that came to be known as the Great Fear. Across rural France in the summer of 1789, peasants rose in revolt. They raided manorial estates, burned records of feudal obligations, and drove out or attacked local lords. In many regions, the old feudal order collapsed not because of official decrees, but because the people had simply decided they would no longer accept it. In some cases, the violence was restrained, lords were chased away, but not harmed. In others, blood was spilled. Noble chateaux went up in flames, legal charters were destroyed, and centuries-old hierarchies were erased in a matter of days. The countryside had become just as revolutionary as the city. Back in Paris, the National Assembly, now calling itself the National Constituent Assembly, watched the chaos unfold with growing alarm. Many of its members were nobles and clergymen themselves, and some feared that the disorder could unravel the entire structure of society. But others recognized that something fundamental had changed, and that reform was no longer a matter of choice, but of survival. On the night of August 4, 1789, the Assembly convened in an emotional and dramatic session. Noblemen stood and, one by one, renounced their ancient privileges. Titles, feudal rights, exclusive hunting laws, and tax exemptions, all were abandoned in a wave of declarations that stunned the chamber. It was a political earthquake, the formal end of feudalism in France. The decrees passed in the following days abolished the centuries-old system that had kept the peasantry in subjugation. From now on, all French citizens were to be equal under the law. No longer would birth determine one's rights or obligations. The nobility, as a distinct legal class, had been dismantled by its own members, though many did so under immense pressure and with the hope of preserving what power they could in the new order. But declarations alone were not enough to define the revolution. The Assembly now turned to the task of drafting a statement of principles, a foundation upon which the future of France could be built. On August 26, 1789, it produced one of the most important documents in modern political history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and the American Declaration of Independence, this document proclaimed that all men were born free and equal in rights. It guaranteed liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Sovereignty, it stated, resided not in the king, but in the nation, in the people. These words rang out across France and beyond. For the oppressed, they were a beacon of hope. For monarchs and nobles elsewhere in Europe, they were a warning. The French Revolution had declared not just the end of feudalism, but the beginning of a new political world, one based on rights, not privilege, on equality, not hierarchy. But as the ink dried on these ideals, the gap between principle and reality would soon be tested in the streets, in the court, and on the scaffold. While the National Assembly declared the end of feudalism and proclaimed the rights of man, much of France continued to suffer under the same crushing burdens as before. Bread, the staple of life for the poor, remained scarce and prohibitively expensive. The harvest of 1789 had been poor, inflation soared, and starvation loomed over the working classes. Words of liberty were inspiring, but words could not be eaten. As hunger deepened, so did the public's frustration with the monarchy. All eyes turned to Versailles, the royal palace just outside Paris, where King Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette, and the royal court still lived in isolated splendor. The contrast between their luxury and the suffering in Paris became unbearable for many. Rumors spread of the queen hoarding grain, of lavish feasts held while children starved in the streets. The phrase, "Let them eat cake," though almost certainly apocryphal, became a symbol of royal indifference and helped turn public resentment into rage. In this growing tension, the next dramatic act of the revolution would not be led by soldiers or intellectuals, but by the women of Paris. On the morning of October 5, 1789, as rain fell over the capital, thousands of women, mostly market workers, mothers, and wives, gathered in front of Paris's City Hall. They had come not with banners and slogans, but with knives, pikes, and a single demand: bread. As the crowd grew more agitated, they began to march. Their destination was clear: Versailles. Along the way, men joined them, including members of the National Guard, who had initially been organized to protect the people. Encouraged by the revolutionary spirit, the guardsmen agreed to escort the marchers. By evening, a crowd of perhaps 10,000 stood outside the gates of the palace, soaked, angry, and determined. They were not only demanding food, they were demanding accountability. The following day, chaos erupted. Some among the crowd breached the palace gates. In the confusion, 2 royal guards were killed, and the mob roamed the marble halls, shouting for the queen. Marie Antoinette barely escaped to the king's chambers, her reputation as a symbol of excess preceding her. Ultimately, King Louis was forced to appear before the crowd from a palace balcony, alongside the queen. He bowed, promised to listen, and, most importantly, agreed to return to Paris with his family. The royal family, once distant and revered, now became prisoners of the people. The next day, a bizarre and powerful procession entered the capital. At the head were the women who had marched, holding aloft pikes decorated with loaves of bread, and in some cases, the heads of the slain guards. Behind them rode the royal carriage. The king, queen, and their children were brought not as honored guests, but as captives of the revolution. They would now reside in the Tuileries Palace, in the heart of Paris, under the watchful eye of the people. This event, known as the October Days, was a turning point. It was a clear signal that the revolution was no longer merely political. It was social, emotional, and immediate. The monarchy, though still technically in power, had lost its mystique. The people had risen, demanded justice, and brought their rulers to heel. And as the revolution gathered speed, it would soon test just how far the French people were willing to go to transform their nation, and at what cost. With the king and queen now living under guard in Paris, the political landscape of France continued to shift rapidly. The National Constituent Assembly worked day and night to draft a new constitution that would create a limited monarchy, a France where the king would remain as head of state, but where true power would reside in a legislative body elected by the people. It was a compromise, a middle path between revolution and tradition. Many hoped it would end the turmoil and establish a stable, constitutional monarchy similar to that of Great Britain. King Louis XVI, however, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the role he was being asked to play. Though he publicly accepted the Assembly's authority and the coming constitution, he remained deeply conflicted. Privately, he saw the changes as illegitimate, a humiliation of the monarchy and a threat to the divine order of kings. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was even more adamantly opposed. She communicated secretly with royalists and foreign allies, urging intervention and plotting escape. Outside of Paris, the revolution was met with mixed reactions. In rural areas, peasants continued to demand land reform and justice. In the cities, workers demanded price controls and fair wages. Meanwhile, the nobility, many of whom had already fled abroad, warned foreign courts that the revolution was spiraling out of control. The monarchs of Europe, particularly Emperor Leopold II of Austria, Marie Antoinette's brother, began to watch events in France with growing alarm. Despite the hope inspired by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the coming constitution, tension was rising. Radical political clubs like the Jacobins gained influence. Newspapers and pamphlets, increasingly hostile to the king, portrayed him as either weak or treacherous. And indeed, behind closed doors, plans were being made, plans for escape. On the night of June 20, 1791, King Louis XVI and his family slipped out of the Tuileries Palace in disguise. Dressed as commoners, they boarded a carriage and set out under cover of darkness, heading east toward the border. The plan was to reach the town of Montmedy, where loyal troops awaited to escort them into Austria. From there, the king hoped to rally support, declare the revolution invalid, and return with foreign assistance to restore his full authority. But the escape did not go as planned. The royal carriage was slow and conspicuous. At several stops, locals recognized the king's face, immortalized on coins and portraits. Word spread. In the town of Varennes, just miles from the border, the royal family was stopped by a local official who had received a warning. The king was recognized, detained, and escorted back to Paris under armed guard. The return was devastating. Crowds gathered silently as the royal family passed. What little trust remained between the monarch and his people evaporated. The flight to Varennes, as it became known, destroyed the illusion that the king supported the revolution. It confirmed the worst fears of many revolutionaries, that Louis was an enemy of the new France, willing to abandon his people and seek help from foreign armies. In response, public sentiment hardened. Monarchists were discredited. Republicans, those who believed France should become a full republic without a king, gained ground. The Assembly, still working on the Constitution, now faced a dangerous question: could a king who had tried to flee still serve as head of state? Though the constitution would eventually be completed and Louis would agree to rule as a constitutional monarch, the events of Varennes had irreversibly changed the revolution. Suspicion turned into anger. Respect became contempt. And the people began to wonder, if kings could not be trusted, perhaps kings were no longer needed at all. By the summer of 1792, France was no longer simply in revolution, it was at war, both within and beyond its borders. The dream of a peaceful, constitutional monarchy was unraveling, and the country was moving inexorably toward radical change and open conflict. The failed escape of the king had fatally damaged the monarchy's reputation, and France's experiment in limited royal power now stood on increasingly unstable ground. Meanwhile, the Legislative Assembly, which had succeeded the National Constituent Assembly after the adoption of the Constitution of 1791, found itself overwhelmed. Economic hardship persisted. Bread prices remained high, and unemployment plagued the cities. The revolution's promises of liberty and equality clashed with the grinding realities of daily life. The political atmosphere in Paris had grown volatile, fueled by fiery rhetoric and street-level activism. Outside the city, foreign powers grew increasingly alarmed by the revolution's reach. Kings and emperors feared that the revolutionary spirit might spread beyond France's borders. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria, hoping to unite the nation against a common enemy and to preempt any foreign intervention. But the war did not go well. French armies were disorganized, poorly supplied, and often led by officers who mistrusted the revolutionary government. As Austrian and Prussian troops advanced, the people of Paris grew terrified. Royalists were suspected of aiding the enemy. The Brunswick Manifesto, issued by the commander of the Prussian forces, threatened to destroy Paris if the royal family were harmed. Instead of deterring violence, the manifesto enraged the French. It confirmed the people's worst fears, that their king was collaborating with foreign invaders. On August 10, 1792, the anger exploded. Revolutionary crowds, led by the radical sans-culottes and members of the Jacobin and Cordeliers clubs, stormed the Tuileries Palace, where the king and queen were living under guard. The palace guards were overwhelmed. Many were killed. The royal family narrowly escaped death by taking refuge in the nearby Legislative Assembly, but they were soon arrested. With the monarchy effectively overthrown, France entered a new and uncertain phase. The Assembly suspended the king's powers and called for the election of a national convention to draft a new constitution, one that would establish a republic. The revolution had shifted from reform to revolution in the truest sense. It no longer sought to change the monarchy, but to abolish it entirely. In the weeks that followed, violence surged. In early September 1792, as rumors spread of royalist uprisings and advancing enemies, mobs stormed prisons across Paris. Over the course of several days, they murdered more than 1,000 prisoners, many of whom had never even been tried. These September massacres horrified moderates and shocked Europe. But for radicals like Georges Danton, they were necessary purges, brutal but essential in the face of internal betrayal. On September 21, 1792, the newly elected National Convention convened. Its first act was decisive and historic. It abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the First French Republic. The centuries-old institution that had ruled France, from the Merovingians to the Bourbons, was no more. But the revolution was not finished. The king, now referred to simply as Citizen Louis Capet, still lived. And for many revolutionaries, as long as he remained alive, he represented a threat, a symbol to royalists, a possible rallying point for enemies of the Republic. The question of his fate would divide France and define the next chapter of the Revolution, a chapter that would spill into trials, tribunals, and executions. With the monarchy abolished and the Republic declared, the French Revolution entered its most tense and dramatic phase. The king, once the central pillar of the French state, now sat in a prison cell in the Temple, stripped of titles, surrounded by guards, and referred to simply as Louis Capet, a symbolic name tying him not to divine right but to common ancestry. For the revolutionaries, his very existence presented a dire dilemma. Could a republic coexist with a living former king? Would he serve as a figurehead for royalist plots? Could France be truly free while he still breathed? Within the newly formed National Convention, debate over Louis's fate divided the revolutionary factions. The moderate Girondins hoped to avoid further bloodshed and sought a fair trial, believing that execution would alienate moderate supporters and provoke foreign aggression. The radical Jacobins, led by men such as Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, argued the opposite. They saw the king not as a man but as a symbol, the embodiment of tyranny, betrayal, and everything the revolution had risen against. His death, they believed, was not only just but necessary. The convention moved forward with a trial. In December 1792, Louis XVI was formally charged with high treason. The evidence included his attempted escape, secret correspondence with foreign powers, and his refusal to support the revolution's reforms. Though the trial was conducted with an air of legality, the outcome was virtually predetermined. On January 15, 1793, the convention declared Louis guilty. The next day, a vote was held on his punishment. It was tense, passionate, and historic. Each deputy stood, one by one, and gave their verdict aloud. The final count was close, but clear. 361 voted for death, 360 for other penalties or delay. By a razor-thin margin, the king was sentenced to die. Louis heard the decision with dignity. In his final days, he wrote letters to his family, forgave his accusers, and prepared for death with calm resolve. On the morning of January 21, 1793, he was taken by carriage through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine awaited. Surrounded by a sea of citizens and soldiers, Louis stepped onto the scaffold. He attempted to speak to the crowd, to assert his innocence and pray for France. But the drums of the National Guard drowned out his voice. The executioners moved swiftly. In moments, the blade fell. The crowd was silent. Some cheered. Others watched in stunned silence. Blood had been spilled, not just the blood of a tyrant, as some saw it, but of a king, a father, a man. The death of Louis XVI sent shockwaves across Europe. Monarchs were horrified. Many saw the execution not as justice, but as murder, a terrifying precedent that threatened every throne on the continent. Britain and the Dutch Republic broke diplomatic ties with France. War expanded. The revolution had begun to devour the old order, and in doing so, it invited retaliation. But within France, something deeper had changed. The revolution, once a movement for reform, was now irreversible. There could be no return to monarchy, no restoration of what had been. The path forward would be shaped not by moderation, but by ideology and force. And with the king dead, power would now fall into the hands of those willing to use terror in the name of liberty. Men who believed that the guillotine was not just a tool of punishment, but a weapon of purification. The execution of King Louis XVI marked a point of no return for the French Revolution. What had begun as a political upheaval had now transformed into something far more volatile, a battle not only for the future of France, but for the very soul of the Republic. The revolution had devoured the monarchy. Now, it would begin to devour itself. Almost immediately after the king's death, France was plunged into chaos. European powers, horrified by the regicide, formed a coalition to crush the revolution. Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and others declared war on France. The fledgling republic was surrounded. Foreign armies pressed on the borders, and internal rebellion broke out in provinces like the Vade, where royalist sympathies ran deep. Within the government, tensions escalated. The Girondins, who had once favored caution and moderation, now found themselves outflanked by the increasingly dominant Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, a man whose calm demeanor masked an unshakable belief in the righteousness of revolutionary virtue. Robespierre believed that terror, if used in the service of liberty, was not a vice but a necessity. The Committee of Public Safety, created in April 1793, quickly became the center of power. Charged with defending the revolution from enemies both foreign and domestic, it soon wielded almost unchecked authority. Robespierre, along with allies like Georges Couthon and Louis Saint-Just, transformed the committee into a revolutionary tribunal, both judge and executioner. Under their watch, the law of suspects was passed. It allowed for the arrest of anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity, a phrase so vague that it included nobles, clergy, former Girondins, or even ordinary citizens who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for the revolution. Trials were swift. Evidence was often circumstantial or entirely lacking. Guilt was presumed. The punishment, more often than not, was death. The guillotine, once a symbol of justice and equality, became a constant presence in Paris. Each day, carts rumbled through the streets carrying the condemned to the Place de la Révolution. Spectators gathered not out of shock, but routine. Some applauded. Others watched in silence. It was a time of fear, accusation, and paranoia. Neighbors denounced one another. Entire families vanished overnight. No one, not even former heroes of the Revolution, was safe. Marie Antoinette, once the Queen of France, met her end on October 16, 1793. Dressed in white, she was jeered by the crowd as she rode through the streets in an open cart. Her trial had been brief. Her guilt, to the tribunal, was self-evident. She was executed, as the king had been, without mercy. In the months that followed, the reign of terror deepened. Georges Danton, once a close ally of Robespierre and one of the Revolution's most powerful orators, began to call for moderation. He warned that the Revolution was eating its own children. For that, he too was arrested, tried, and executed in April 1794. His final words before the blade fell: "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Jean-Paul Marat, the radical journalist whose newspaper had incited violence against the Girondins, had already met a bloody end, stabbed to death in his bath by Charlotte Corday, a young woman who hoped to bring peace by ending one voice of hatred. By the summer of 1794, the Revolution stood in a paradox. It had proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, yet ruled by fear. It had promised justice, yet delivered mass execution. The guillotine stood as both symbol and sentence. The Republic, born in idealism, now survived by the blade. But even Robespierre, the incorruptible, would not be spared by the storm he had unleashed. By mid-1794, the French Revolution had become a revolution in crisis. The Reign of Terror, which had begun as a defense of liberty, now seemed endless, devouring all who dared question its guardians. The streets of Paris echoed with the sound of marching booths and tumbling carts, while the air itself carried the weight of suspicion. Thousands had died, nobles and peasants, radicals and moderates, the guilty and the innocent alike. And at the center of it all stood Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre had once been admired for his incorruptible morals, his steady dedication to Enlightenment ideals, and his belief that virtue must guide the Republic. But as the months passed, he appeared increasingly isolated, aloof, and consumed by his own vision of revolutionary purity. Those who had once stood by his side, Danton, Desmoulins, Hébert, were now in their graves, executed by the very regime they had helped build. To Robespierre, their deaths were necessary sacrifices. He believed that only through terror could virtue prevail, and only through virtue could the Republic survive. His speeches grew darker, his warnings more dire. He spoke of enemies within, of corruption in high places, of plots that needed to be rooted out. But he named no names. And that uncertainty began to terrify even his allies. In June 1794, the executions escalated with the passing of the Law of 22 Prairial. Under this law, citizens accused of counter-revolutionary activity were denied legal defense. Trials became formalities. The guillotine quickened. That month alone, over 1,300 people were executed in Paris. The line between revolutionary and victim grew thinner with each dawn. Even as death surged, Robespierre unveiled his most ambitious project, the Festival of the Supreme Being, held on June 8, 1794. He had long believed that religion, particularly the Catholic Church, had corrupted the people. Now he proposed a new civic faith, worshipping reason and a vague deity of morality, the supreme being. Dressed in a sky-blue coat and holding flowers, Robespierre led a procession through the streets, ascending an artificial mountain before tens of thousands of spectators. He spoke with fervor, comparing the revolution to divine revelation. But to many, the spectacle was unnerving. His words, once inspiring, now rang with fanaticism. Some whispered that he saw himself not merely as a revolutionary, but as a prophet, or worse, as a god. In the weeks that followed, fear turned to panic. Members of the National Convention, who had once supported Robespierre, now began to wonder if they would be next. He had spoken of traitors among them. But who? When would their names be read aloud? When would the guards arrive at their doors? The breaking point came on July 26, 1794, 8 Thermidor, year 2. Robespierre addressed the convention, delivering a vague but ominous speech about conspirators in their midst. He refused to name them. The deputies, many already living in terror, saw their own doom reflected in his silence. The next day, the convention struck back. They interrupted Robespierre during his speech, shouted him down, and declared him an outlaw. He was arrested along with his close allies Saint-Just, Couthon, and Le Biais. That night, chaos erupted as Robespierre briefly escaped with the help of loyalists, only to be captured again. Wounded and broken, his jaw shattered by a pistol shot, possibly self-inflicted, he was taken to the conciergerie. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre was executed, along with 21 of his followers. The blade fell on the man who had sent so many to it. The terror was over. But though the guillotine slowed, the revolution was far from complete. France had banished its king, its queen, and now its most radical voice. A new era was dawning, one of exhaustion, disillusionment, and the search for order after chaos. With the execution of Maximilien Robespierre in the summer of 1794, the French Revolution entered a new phase, one no longer driven by virtue or terror, but by exhaustion, pragmatism, and the desire for stability after years of chaos. The period that followed, known as the Thermidorian reaction, saw the dismantling of the radical machinery Robespierre had built and a sharp swing away from the violent idealism that had defined the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of its powers. The revolutionary tribunals were dissolved or greatly weakened. Thousands of prisoners were released. The Jacobins, once the dominant political force, were suppressed. Political clubs were closed, newspapers silenced. France began to breathe again, but the scars ran deep. In the streets, a new kind of violence emerged, the White Terror, a wave of reprisals against former radicals. Mobs attacked those associated with the Jacobins, especially in southern cities. Many were beaten, some killed. It was not organized or state-sponsored like the Terror, but it revealed the deep fractures in the nation's psyche. The revolution had not united the people, it had torn them into bitter and suspicious camps. Meanwhile, the economy remained fragile. Inflation, food shortages, and unemployment plagued the Republic. The war with foreign powers continued, draining resources and testing the patience of a weary population. In this uncertain environment, the National Convention drafted yet another constitution, the Constitution of 1795, establishing a new government called the Directory. The Directory consisted of a bicameral legislature and a 5-man executive committee. It was designed to prevent the concentration of power seen under Robespierre and to restore moderate republican governance. But it was far from stable. Corruption ran rampant. The Directory lacked popular legitimacy. Royalist uprisings flared, and Jacobin conspiracies lingered in the shadows. To survive, the Directory relied heavily on the army, and among its generals, one name began to rise above the rest: Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1795, Napoleon crushed a royalist rebellion in Paris with swift brutality, using cannon fire on civilian streets, an act that earned him both fear and fame. His military campaigns in Italy and Egypt would soon catapult him to national stardom. He was young, ambitious, and brilliant. Where politicians floundered, he triumphed. The people saw in him not just a general, but a possible savior. By 1799, the Directory had lost all credibility. France was once again on the edge of collapse. In November of that year, 18 Brumaire, year 8, Napoleon seized power in a swift and nearly bloodless coup. The revolution, born in the name of liberty and popular sovereignty, now gave way to the rule of one man. The French consulate was born, with Napoleon as first consul. Within 5 years, he would crown himself emperor. The French Revolution had begun in 1789 with cries for bread, justice, and representation. It had overthrown kings, upended centuries of tradition, and inspired fear and hope across Europe. It had unleashed terror in the name of virtue, and virtue in the face of tyranny. And now, it had brought forth a new kind of ruler, not a king by birth, but a monarch by merit and might. Though the revolution formally ended, its legacy endured. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, the abolition of feudalism, and the idea of citizenship would echo across history. Revolutions in Haiti, Latin America, and even 19th-century Europe would be shaped by the ideals born in Paris. France had been remade, not gently, but with fire and steel. And the world would never be the same again,